Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inside Investing, the show that helps you level up your financial knowledge and sharpen your investing skills. I'm your host, Brian Rogers. On today's program, we're going to tackle one of the trickiest parts of retirement planning, and that's figuring out how much you can safely spend each year. The nightmare scenario for many retirees would be running out of money too soon, but there's also the risk of spending too little and missing out on the best our golden years have to offer. That's why some investors find it helpful to calculate a safe withdrawal rate. It's a rough idea of how much they can draw down their portfolio each year to finance their lifestyle if their assumptions hold true. Let's learn more about how to crunch the numbers. Here with us is Ben Felix, Head of Research and Portfolio Manager at PWL Capital. Ben, it's great to have you on the program.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
We sometimes hear that there's that $1 million suggested as the amount of money most Canadians will need to retire. Do you think there's a magic number that works for most people that's worth considering?
I don't think so, and I think we'll get into the details of why there is no single magic number for everybody. But in broad strokes, everyone's got a different situation. Everyone's got different spending needs, and the thing is, everyone's going to have a different budget. But not only on the spending side, everyone's also going to have different income streams, like different amounts from Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security, and maybe other pension plans and things like that. So to say that there's a single magic number that's going to solve retirement for everybody, I think that would be pretty extreme. So no, I don't think that there is a magic number.
Yeah, I think you're right. Everybody's situation is definitely different. So that's something we'll jump into a little bit later in our conversation. But before we get to that, I do have a trivia question for our audience. How much money do Canadians believe they will need to save in order to retire comfortably, according to a survey by BMO in February of 2023? We'll reveal the answer at the end of our conversation, so stay tuned. Okay, so let's get into our conversation here. First off, what would you say are the key steps in creating a well-crafted retirement plan?
Bill Sharp, who's a Nobel laureate, once referred to retirement income as the nastiest, hardest problem in finance, which I think is probably true. Um, so for planning around that, I think you need to start with understanding what your assets are. You've got to know what your balance sheet looks like. You've got to know how much you have in your RRSP, your registered retirement savings plan, your tax-free savings account. You've got to know how much you have in your taxable investments. You've also got to know your pension entitlements, and that's both employer pensions, if you're lucky enough to have one, or your Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security. You've also got to know how much you expect to add to those savings between now and your planned retirement. Related to that, what your retirement income streams are going to be. So that's assets and savings. That's one big side of the equation. But I've alluded earlier to budgeting, which is kind of the other side of the retirement equation. You've got to know how much you plan to spend, in retirement. Now, one of the aspects of retirement spending that's always going to be uncertain, and this is one of the things I mentioned that makes this whole process kind of hard, is that we don't know how long we're going to live. So you've got to make assumptions about your life expectancy, and FP Canada, the body that administers the CFP designation in Canada, they do produce recommended assumptions or guidelines for life expectancy for the purpose of financial planning. So nobody can predict what that number is going to be, but it's kind of the recommendation is to use a conservative estimate based on Canadian mortality tables. And then the other thing that we have to have is assumptions about expected returns for stocks and bonds. And that's, again, something FP Canada does produce assumptions for that. PWL Capital, the firm that I work for, also produces assumptions that people can use as a guideline for doing this stuff. And then tying all that together, you've got your savings, your expected savings, your expected returns. You've got to project into the future about how much money you're going to have so that you can figure out what your retirement assets are going to look like.
So there's so many different things you have to factor in, but I think it's important to look at all those assumptions and try and predict many of those unknowns. Would you agree with that?
You have to make predictions, and this is why retirement planning is challenging. You've got to make predictions about the future, but because they're predictions, I think having that flexibility makes the whole process more realistic. If you try and have a very rigid plan that only works if your exact assumptions work out the way that you expected them to, that's probably a recipe for disaster.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Of course, one of the challenges with creating a retirement spending plan is that nobody knows how investments will perform in the future. Some investors might consider historical results and project them into the future. What are some of the potential pitfalls with this approach you feel, they should consider?
Yeah, it's a really important question. If we look back at U.S. stocks and say, "Wow, those returns have been great. Let's use those to project into the future," that's uh, probably setting yourself up for a letdown, just because U.S. stocks have been such an anomaly. When you look globally, stock returns have still been great. They've still been better than bond returns for sure, but they've not been nearly as good as what you would be led to believe if you just looked at the U.S. data. So, to reiterate, I really do think that historical data are useful in setting expectations, but I think you've got to look past the U.S. market, and I think you've also got to look sufficiently far back in history to capture some of the bad outcomes that have happened for many stock markets. For the purpose of financial planning, don't use the single best outlier market and say, I'm going to condition my expectations on that.
In your opinion, how might an investor set what you feel are reasonable expectations for investment returns through their retirement?
From the numbers that I've looked at, in the U.S., historical returns have been about 6.2% real going back to 1900, or about 9.4% nominal for U.S. In more recent history, it's around 10%, and that's a number I see thrown around on the internet often enough, where people are like, "Yeah, U.S. market 10% historical returns. That's what I'm going to project into the future." I don't know about that. When you look at global returns, so including the US, but also including other countries, it's been closer to 5% real, or about 8% nominal, going back to 1900. So that's a more reasonable starting point, at least. So we've just shaved off like 1.4% in nominal terms, or 1.2% in real terms from the historical data, just extending to global data. Now, the other thing that we know is that current market prices contain a lot of information about expected returns. So if we take a metric like the Shiller cyclically adjusted price earnings ratio, which is basically like it's basically the price earnings ratio, but it smooths earnings out over a period of time to make the metric a little bit more, it's supposed to make the metric a little bit more useful. That a metric like that tells us what expected return the market is currently pricing into stocks. And just for some intuition, if you take stocks with very high valuations, so their prices are very high relative to their fundamentals, in that case, the market is pricing in a very low expected return. So valuation metrics like that, they don't predict the future, but they do contain information about what the market is pricing in terms of expected returns. And when you look empirically, it's not a perfect relationship. Like we can't predict a point estimate future return based on the current price earnings ratio, the current cyclically adjusted price earnings ratio. But there's definitely information where when prices are relatively high, future returns tend to be a little bit lower. And when prices are low, when expected returns are high, future returns tend to be a little bit higher.
Speaking of that, so we've seen inflation shoot higher in recent years, and we also experienced what's being described as a once in a century global pandemic in 2020. How can investors plan for unpredictable events like these in retirement?
I think that one of the ideas behind using these broad sets of historical data that I've been talking about, so getting data from all countries that have had stock markets going back, the most comprehensive paper I've seen goes back to 1890, I believe. But what you get by looking at that type of data is you capture all of those historical black swan events. So using that data to plan for the future at least lets you take into account all of the unexpected crazy stuff that happened in the past. Now, the problem with that, the limitation of that, is that historical black swan events don't predict future black swan events, like by definition, because the black swan event is something that was not predicted. But I do at least think that taking that broader historical perspective is a good starting point. I think that the best way to deal with uncertainty about the future is diversification. Global diversification within stocks and potentially in bonds is a good idea. Last time I was on this show, we talked about having exposure to multiple risk premiums. So that's being exposed not only to stocks, but potentially increasing your exposure to things like value stocks, which have an independent risk premium on top of the equity risk premium. So that this type of diversification that I'm talking about is not just geographic, but I think within each geographic region, you can also maintain exposure to multiple investment styles, I guess you could call it, with robust risk premiums.
Yeah, so I think diversification is the key on there, which is another point you were making. So definitely for those viewers, look at that. There's all kinds of content out there about diversification, but that was a key point on that for sure. Switching gears a little bit, Ben, in your opinion, how might investors consider retirement support programs like the Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security? How would they consider that into their retirement spending plan?
I've seen a lot of people make comments like, "Oh, I don't want to count on those," or "We'll plan without those." I think that's an error, and I think it's an error because Canada Pension Plan (CPP) and Old Age Security (OAS), especially with the current expansion that CPP is going through right now, these are going to be two of the most valuable assets for most retirees. Now, these are inflation indexed annuities, and you can't really get those anywhere else. So they're really powerful tools. That means that the payments that you get from them rise with inflation. An annuity means that it's an asset that pays you as long as you're alive. Another way to say that is that they provide longevity insurance. They provide insurance against you living longer than you expected. So from that perspective, they're also extremely valuable. The government of Canada does have a retirement income calculator that can help you estimate your CPP and OAS benefits. But I do want to emphasize that calculating or estimating your future CPP benefit is very complex. There are people who specialize only in consulting on that, estimating what your future benefit's going to be and maximizing your future benefit, because there are so many little details and elections and decisions that can go into what the ultimate benefit you get is going to be. One planning strategy that relates a bit to longevity insurance, but I think it's just smart planning in general, is deferring your CPP and potentially your OAS benefits. You get an increase in the amount of the benefit, of the lifetime benefit, for each month that you defer after the age of 65. So those increases can be pretty significant. In the case of CPP, you can get an increase of up to 42% by deferring the benefit from age 65 to age 70. OAS gets a slightly smaller deferral benefit, but same idea. You can also take CPP early, in which case you get penalized. So age 65 is I guess you can call it the normal start date. So deferring those government pensions increases if you live long enough. And now we're back to one of those other areas of uncertainty. If you live long enough, deferring CPP and potentially deferring OAS, and I just say potentially because the benefit's a little bit smaller. But if you live to be 95 or something like that, deferring those pensions is going to be a windfall. It'll be very beneficial.
Yeah, definitely an important thing to include. And I like how you were saying, there's going to be different calculations as well, depending on if you're planning to take it early or late. But just getting that initial assumption is important as well. Thanks for clarifying that, Ben. So one of the tools some investors use to help them figure out how much they can spend in retirement is called a safe withdrawal rate. So how does it work, and what information would an investor need to make the calculation?
So the concept, though, and it's a powerful concept. It comes from an American financial planner named Bill Bengen, or William Bengen. He came up with this idea in the 1990s. He wanted to figure out how much his clients could safely spend from their portfolios in retirement without running out of money. And the way that he framed it is he wanted to find the percentage of a portfolio that you could spend in the first year of retirement, and then adjust that number for inflation each year thereafter without running out of money. And that number, that starting percentage, is now what we call the safe withdrawal rate. So what he did is he ran simulations in US historical data, and he ran these rolling periods from 1926 to 1991. At the time when he wrote the paper, that's the data he had available to him. And he just wanted to find what is the spending rate that was sustainable in the worst 30-year period in US market history. Now, it's important to remember, especially because the most commonly referenced safe withdrawal rate is 4%, and that it's usually referred to as the 4% rule. But I think it's much more accurate to call these things guidelines than rules. And again, it relates back to this being the nastiest, hardest problem in finance. The challenge is that safe withdrawal rate calculations are sensitive to all kinds of inputs. The retirement period is a big one. So Bengen's original 4% finding was based on optimizing for a 30-year withdrawal rate. But if we push that out to 40 years or 50 years, which is relevant to early retirees in particular, that safe spending rate can drop pretty quickly. And then it's sensitive to the data that we're using. Like Bill Bengen used US stocks and US intermediate term treasuries. But if we extend that, and we'll talk about this later, I think if we extend that to other data series, that changes materially what the safe spending rate is.
And so this could even apply, Ben, as well. So if somebody was using their retirement account, like you said, your portfolio, if you had a pension or other sources of income, you could just figure out, okay, how much do I need on top of that would be the number you would use as sort of that numerator to figure out, a certain amount you would need each month or year. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So if you're figuring out how much you need to, you're figuring out with the safe withdrawal rate how much you can withdraw from your portfolio. So if you have $40,000 of pension income and $60,000 of projected retirement expenses, the safe withdrawal rate is just going to be applied to that $20,000 difference that you need to cover from your investments, because everything else is covered by, in my example, by guaranteed pensions.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, let's get into some of the ways to calculate a safe withdrawal rate. A common approach is to assume a constant rate of spending throughout retirement, as suggested by the 4% rule. How does this approach work?
Yeah, so that's the one that William Bengen came up with that I mentioned earlier. To calculate your safe withdrawal rate for your individual situation, you can divide your desired level of spending in the first year of retirement by your expected portfolio size at retirement. And that percentage gives you your first year withdrawal rate. And if it then, so you can compare that to a benchmark. So if we use the 4% rule as the example of a benchmark rate, if you calculate your first year withdrawal rate in retirement and you find that it's 6%, you might say, oh, I should probably save more or cut back my retirement spending budget. Now, the other way that you can use the concept is that you can divide your spending target by the safe withdrawal rate. So you take that first year of retirement spending and divide it by whatever you've determined the safe withdrawal rate to be. That gives you the portfolio size that you need to have accumulated by retirement.
There's been a lot of research into the 4% rule. What does that data say about how reliable it is in estimating a safe withdrawal rate?
Wade Pfau had a paper in 2017, and to my knowledge, he's the first one that really looked at this, testing this concept internationally. He looked at 22 global markets and found that the US, Canada, Denmark, and New Zealand historically supported the 4% spending rule, but the 18 other countries in the sample had success rates between 94% and 38%, depending on the period. He found about 3.5% as the rate that most countries could support. When we say that the 4% rule doesn't work in other countries, it doesn't mean that it never works. It means that it fails more frequently. So somebody could say, I'm okay with a 40% chance of running out of money in retirement. Most people wouldn't be okay with that. But if somebody were okay with that, they could still be happy with a 4% spending rule. A more recent paper, 2022 paper from a guy named Scott Cederberg and some co-authors, and Scott was on our podcast as well. So they looked at historical returns for 38 developed markets between 1890 and 2019. So relative to the Wade Pfau data that I just mentioned, this goes back 10 years earlier, but it's also expanded to many more countries. They found a much lower 2.26% safe withdrawal rate at a 95% success rate using a 60-40 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio. And they actually found that was the highest safe withdrawal rate among all asset allocations they tested, including international stocks in there. One of the things that historically international stocks have been really good for is hedging against local inflation. So they find same setup, except in this case for the equity portion of the 60-40 portfolio, they've got 10% in domestic, so say a hypothetical Canadian investor, 10% in Canadian stocks and 90% in international stocks. And that increased their safe withdrawal rate finding to closer to 3%. And that actually included some additional costs for owning foreign stocks to account for higher fees and withholding tax costs and stuff like that. Anyway, so now we've gone from Wade Pfau's 3.5% to Scott Cederberg's 2.26% in domestic stocks, and then including international stocks, we're back up to about 3%. But in all cases, much lower than the 4% rule that many people are familiar with.
Well, that brings me to a question I was going to ask you as well, is that, there is some research out there that the 4% is a bit high. And I know you've talked about that, but you've also talked about the fact that you're not a big fan of the constant spending rate in retirement. Why is that?
I don't think constant dollar spending is realistic because think about the case where constant dollar spending fails. It's a case where you get a really bad series of returns, but constant dollar spending assumes that you keep on spending your same whatever the constant dollar is adjusted for inflation every year, even though you see the market tanking and the world collapsing around you or whatever's happening. No one's going to spend their portfolio down to zero when they know they have 20 years left to retirement and they see the market crashing around them. They're going to cut back on their spending. Like, come on. I think that's especially true if people have pensions that they can rely on, where in some cases your portfolio spending could be cut to zero because you can live on your pensions. Constant inflation adjusted spending can be very inefficient from the perspective of, I mean, it's the best way to explain it, I think, is how much of your money you can use while you're alive without dramatically increasing the risk of running out of money. So a very inefficient spending path would mean there's a huge wide range of potential outcomes at the end of life. So say it's a 30-year period. You're either going to have, 10 times more than you started with, or you're going to be broke. That huge range of potential outcomes is a sign of spending inefficiency. You don't get to spend much of your money because the range of outcomes is so wide that you have to take the most conservative approach. If people adjust their spending a bit, depending on how their investments have been performing, like spending a little bit less in bad times, maybe a little bit more in good times, they can spend more of their money during life without dramatically increasing the probability of running out of money, which again, that's a sign of spending efficiency. Adding in that flexibility to retirement spending analysis, it changes the math pretty significantly on how much you have to have saved. Or alternatively, it changes that first year withdrawal rate that you can sustain. If you're going to be very flexible with your spending in the future, that first year withdrawal rate is going to be quite a bit higher than if you're planning on being completely rigid.
All right, yeah, I actually had the fortunate event of my grandmother lived to be well into her 90s. And I actually saw what you were talking about, Ben, where she was constantly, and she would ask me, because I was in the financial industry, she would ask me, well, should I stop taking some money out of my investments because now I'm getting a whole bunch of money in my savings account? What should I do with that? So that constant rate, I think you're exactly right. She was spending a lot less, not really doing as many things or traveling. I wasn't driving, things of that nature. So you can really see how that adjustment can be made. And you don't want to be taking too much out or you're running into that problem. What do I do with this extra money that's sitting in my bank account? Okay, another approach to calculating a safe withdrawal rate is to assume you would withdraw a constant percentage of the portfolio throughout retirement. How does this approach work?
Constant percentage of the portfolio, in that case, we'd be taking 4%, just to keep it the same number. You'd be taking 4% of your starting portfolio balance every year. So that means that if your portfolio drops by 20% or whatever, your spending that following year is also going to drop by a significant amount. In the case of constant percentage of the portfolio, your spending is going to be extremely volatile because it'll match the volatility of your portfolio. But the interesting thing about it is that it's going to be extremely efficient and you're never going to run out of money. You might end up spending very low amounts, but you mathematically can't run out of money if you're always spending whatever 5% of your portfolio or 4% of your portfolio every year. So from that perspective, you can't. This spending path can't fail in the sense that you can't run out of money, but it can fail in the sense that you can fall below your minimum spending threshold and you can be miserable because you have to cancel your golf membership one year or whatever. Stop buying organic groceries the next year, and then you can go on a world around the world cruise the next year. And that living like that's miserable. I think people like some level of predictability in their lifestyle.
And you don't want to cancel that golf membership. I know I don't want to.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, now there are other variations that fall somewhere in between those two extremes. Like how do those work?
There are a ton of different dynamic spending rules, so I'm not going to try and cover all of them. There are some pretty interesting papers that do review them and compare them. But I'll talk about one that Vanguard came out with because I think it's just very intuitive to think about. It's kind of a hybrid of constant dollar spending and constant percentage spending. They called this their dynamic withdrawal rate. It starts out similar to constant percentage spending, but the change in spending from year to year has a floor and a ceiling. So after a really bad year in the market, you're going to adjust your spending down as if you were taking the constant percentage approach. So that means if your portfolio is down 20%, you're taking the, say it's 4% of the lower portfolio balance based on the decline. But you're only going to allow the dollar amount of spending to drop down to a predetermined floor. And similarly, after a really good year, you're only going to allow it to increase up to a ceiling. So you're getting some of that flexibility that you get from the constant percentage spending strategy, and you're getting some of those efficiency gains of variable spending, but you're also keeping the volatility of your year-to-year spending in check by applying that ceiling and the floor. And then the interesting thing about that is that it can be tailored to whatever ceiling and floor retirees are comfortable with. So that's just one approach to doing that, and I think it's an easy one to think about. But again, there are a ton of different ways to approach that.
Well, what does the research suggest about the reliability of a dynamic withdrawal rate?
The Vanguard one that I mentioned, they looked at this in a paper. They made some assumptions, as you have to do in running these types of scenarios, but they took $1 million starting portfolio. They had a 50% stock, 50% bond asset allocation. They looked at a 30-year period. They had a 5% starting withdrawal rate, and they had a 5% ceiling on their year-to-year increases and a negative 2.5% floor on their decreases from year to year. Now, their research kind of confirms what we would expect based on the comments that I made earlier, which is that the constant percentage approach has the highest success rate, which makes sense because we know it can't deplete the portfolio. And then that's followed by the dynamic spending approach. And with their 5% starting spending, it's no surprise that they find that the constant dollar gives quite a low success. Constant percentage has a much higher volatility in annual spending, which again, we would expect, and that may be okay for some people, but maybe not for other people. Constant dollar spending has the widest range in outcomes of ending assets, which, as I mentioned earlier, that's evidence of spending inefficiency. And in this specific paper, they find that flexibility in the spending floor is more impactful to improving success rates than increasing the spending ceiling is to decreasing success rates, which is kind of an interesting finding from that paper. Allowing for more flexibility allows for, and we see this in the Vanguard paper sort of indirectly, where they find at a 5% constant dollar rate, your success rate was quite low. But if you allow for flexibility with a starting 5% rate, your success rate increases to a level that's probably acceptable to more people. So all of these dynamic strategies, they're going to allow for, and I alluded to this earlier, they're going to allow for a starting spending rate and probably lifetime total spending, which relates back to that concept of spending efficiency, that's going to be higher than constant dollar spending. I think that the baseline that we're improving upon is probably more like 3% as opposed to 4%. So a lot of this is saying, well, hey, if we do dynamic spending, we can get an extra 1%, which brings us up from the 4% baseline. And I'm kind of saying, well, I think that constant dollar starting point, rather than a 4% rule, we should probably be thinking about a 3%, roughly, depending on the situation, but call it a 3% benchmark. So dynamic spending might improve on top of that, but we're talking about going from 3 to 4 as a first-year spending rate, not from 4 to 5.
So it sounds like, too, going back to our earlier conversation about flexibility, you still want to have that flexibility of knowing, okay, you can either adjust things when you are retired, but you also in the planning aspect want to look at, okay, what are some things I can be flexible on?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, one of my biggest takeaways in looking at all of this research and looking at the safe spending rates and how flexibility affects them, that flexibility point is probably the most important thing that I've come away with, where if you're making assumptions about the future, you have to be flexible, and allowing for flexibility, modeling flexibility when you're doing your retirement planning is going to make the whole future picture look that much better. I mean, I think it's, when I say that it's a 3% safe spending rate that you should be planning for, that can be depressing for a lot of people, because that means you got to save a lot of money to fund your future expenses. But if we say, just hypothetically, that allowing for some flexibility lets you increase that first year spending rate by 1% to 4%, then all of a sudden the amount that you need to save drops by quite a bit. So I do think that the flexibility is important, both because it's more practical, but also because it's going to reduce the amount that people need to target as a savings amount.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, Ben. Thanks for walking us through some of the ways to estimate a sustainable amount of spending in retirement. I'm sure you've given our viewers plenty of food for thought as they break out their calculators and crunch those numbers for themselves. Now, before we wrap things up, let's reveal the answer to our trivia question. As a refresher, the question was, how much money do Canadians believe they will need to save to retire comfortably, according to a survey by BMO in February of 2023? And the answer is Canadians surveyed by BMO said they believe they will need $1.7 million to retire comfortably. That's up 20% from the $1.4 million they estimated they would need back in 2020. So have you heard those numbers before, Ben? Any surprise there that it's way up?
Well, no. I mean, I think we know that inflation increased quite a bit, so the cost of just stuff increased. So I think people's retirement budgets probably increased too. So to see that jump does make sense. I would love to dig into each survey respondent's methodology for coming
Yeah,
up with their retirement
me
number,
too
though.
as well. I know. I think you always hear that $1 million number for a long, long time was that's what it was. I'm thinking it totally makes sense that it's gone way up. But yeah, I think everybody's situation will be different, and I'm sure some are a bit higher and some are a bit lower. So that'd be interesting to see the individual results for sure. Thanks again for joining us, Ben. And for those in our audience, make sure to register for our upcoming live webinars and check out our library of on-demand content available in the Learning Center and on our YouTube page. See you all next time.